Beyond the wilds they speak your name with reverence and regret, for none could shape our restless kind, yet you the order set. Beneath your gaze we learn to change, to build, to rise, to last. World you gave to greed that couldn't hold its past.
Power rarely stays what it claims to be at the start. It begins as something simple, protection, order, and survival, but the moment it becomes organized into a system, it starts to change shape. Before it became the kingdom we recognize, Hallownest was something much more primal, ruled by instinct of older powers, and a lack of unified structure. It wasn't a civilization in the way we understand it, but rather a collection of insects simply existing without a shared system or direction. That all changed when a certain Wyrm arrived. He didn't just take control, he transformed the world itself, introducing order, language, and most importantly, intelligence. This gift of intelligence is what allowed the bugs of Hallownest to evolve into something more. They became capable of thought, communication, and creation, building cities and forming new laws, developing a functioning society as a whole. What was once an unorganized and instinct-driven turned into a structured kingdom. The world became unified under a single system, where everything had a place and a purpose. But that transformation came with a hidden cost, because all of that progress, every part of the kingdom was built around the Pale King's idea of order. Hallownest didn't just grow naturally, it was shaped, controlled, and maintained through his vision of what a perfect civilization should be. And that's what makes it important. Because everything Hallownest succeeds, all of it traces back to him. He isn't just a ruler in the traditional sense. He's what we refer to as a higher being. More specifically, an ancient godlike creature that existed long before Hallownest itself. His remains can actually be found deep within the kingdom's edge, where his original massive form lies abandoned. The exact nature of these higher beings isn't fully understood. Hollow Knight never clearly explains where their power comes from or why certain bugs exist on a level far above normal creatures. We see figures like Grandmother Silk, who is also related as a pale being too, another powerful being who appears to exist on a similar divine level. Then there is the Radiance, an ancient moth-like god who once held control over the minds and beliefs of the bugs of Hallownest through dreams. Even after being sealed away, her influence continued through the infection. It was ruled over by the Moth tribe. She was one of the original higher beings of the world who was worshipped by them as a source of light, guidance, and shared memory, as the moths who worshipped her were bound together through shared devotion, seeing her as both a deity and source of purpose. However, when the Pale King arrived and introduced a new order, his influence began to replace older forms of belief. Not every area was fully brought into the kingdom, though. Some places remained independent or resisted that control entirely. Deepness, for example, stayed separate and hostile, never truly becoming a part of Hallownest's kingdom. The Hive also existed on its own, completely shutting themselves off into their own nest. There were also groups like the Mantis tribe who didn't fully submit but instead coexisted with the kingdom on their own terms, forming a kind of balance rather than direct loyalty. The Roman Empire didn't begin as a massive power people remember it as. It started as a single city and slowly expanded outward over time, bringing surrounding regions under its control through a mix of influence and alliance. As it grew, it introduced its own systems and laws, infrastructure, and governance into the lands it absorbed, reshaping them into something more unified under a single rule. This expansion allowed Rome to become incredibly advanced and organized. Roads connected distant regions and cities were developed with consistent structure, and communication across the empire became more efficient than ever before. But despite that sense of unity, the empire was never completely the same throughout. At the center of this was its ruler, the emperor, who held ultimate authority over the entire system, who transformed Rome from a republic into a unified empire after years of internal conflict. Rather than presenting himself as a tyrant, Augustus carefully crafted the image of a stabilizing leader, someone who was restoring order and protecting the people. But this kind of power came with a trade-off. Because so much depended on the emperor, the stability of the entire system was closely tied to decisions and abilities of a single individual. While strong leadership could maintain order, any weakness or failure at the top could affect the entire empire. Just like Augustus, the Pale King doesn't present himself as a conqueror driven by chaos, but as a figure of order, someone who arrives during a time of instability and reshapes the world into something unified and controlled. For Grandmother Silk's arrival, Pharloom was a scattered land made up of independent regions like Maso Grotto and Farfields, with open grass and wind plains, where nomadic bugs and tribes lived among people. Shellwood's dense forested zones tied to early hunter societies in the lower region, which originally functioned as the natural cave systems, each developed on its own culture, with no central rule. Grandmother Silk destroyed that foundation, invading what was alright by their own, using her presence to influence her reign and to be worshipped. Her influence spread through her everlasting song that weaved through Pharloom with her use of abundance amount of silk. The first ones to be born to help her achieve this were the Reavers, a smart-like spider race already skilled with silk who were considered her children. Under her influence, their natural abilities became something more spiritual, and weaving turned into a kind of devotion. Their existence is a sacred duty to them. The Weavers fully accepted Grandmother Silk as a kind of divine mother figure and helped build up her influence across Pharloom. Over time, once that foundation was set, the idea of her stopped being something new or controversial and slowly became the default way of life worked across Pharloom. Different regions and tribes started adapting it to their own ways, but they were all being pulled into the empire. What used to be independent communities with their own beliefs and traditions gradually got folded into a larger structure centered around the citadel. Tribes that resisted were either pushed out, absorbed, or slowly broken down economically and culturally. Some were re-educated into the new system, taught alignment with the new foundation she set off to, while others simply couldn't sustain themselves. The kingdom was stripped of their resources in regions like Bylewater, which originally was a far more natural, thriving wetland. It wasn't a polluted, decaying place it became later on. It was rich with life, water systems, and natural resources that local communities depended on. But as Pharloom industrialized, Bylewater was gradually turned into a resource extraction zone. The Green Prince was once the ruler of Virginia, a kingdom that has long since fallen. He originally ruled alongside his partner, and together they represented the last true era of Virginia before its collapse. When the Citadel's influence and Pharloom's wider decay began spreading, Virginia didn't survive as a proper kingdom anymore. That goes alongside with the Crust King Khan. His empire collapsed when the sands of Carrick dried out, showing us how cruel the Mother Silk can really be. As the empire expanded, figures like them were either politically weakened, isolated, or forced into a position where their influence couldn't really compete with the rising silk hierarchy. In a way, they represent the last echoes of Pharloom's earlier balance with nature before anything was absorbed into the industrial devotion. As the empire fully formed, it stopped being just a system of influence and became a full worship-based civilization. Every region was expected to contribute in some way to the Grandmother Silk's design. Entire landscapes were reshaped into production zones, feeding the citadel and surroundings infrastructure. Traditions began forming around this system in a way that felt less spiritual and more like a structured labor disguised as belief. In places like the Citadel, work wasn't just survival, it was framed as devotion, where constant production and effort were tied directly to honoring them. Over time, enslavement itself was turned into a sacred thing, making it easier to justify control because people were just obeying, they believed they were meant to, almost like a form of ideological conditioning where belief was used to keep everything running. This is especially similar to what happened during the expansion of colonizing societies in places like the Americas, where indigenous groups such as the Native Americans faced both outcomes. Some resisted and remained separate for as long as possible, while others were assimilated and their beliefs and traditions were altered and erased over time. Despite the way the king shaped Hallownest, he isn't really portrayed as a purely cruel or tyrannical figure. In Hollow Knight, he comes across as someone who genuinely believes he is doing what is best for the world. However, that kindness is tightly connected to control, in a way of caring that is structured and absolute. In contrast to that, Pharloom's system feels much more exploitative. Let's not forget that Pharloom's currency is worser and feels far more like a dictatorship. Authority isn't just political, it's ideological. They follow the system because they want to. That kind of control goes deeper than laws or systems. It shapes how people think, act, and exist within the space, brainwashing them. But just because you see a contrast, don't let that fool you from how Hallownest was made. It wasn't a natural utopian civilization. The Dreamers especially show how far that control goes. They willingly give up their lives, sealing themselves away to contain a threat, becoming permanent parts of a system designed to preserve the kingdom. It's treated as a noble, even necessary, act of kindness, but at the same time it shows how much individuals are expected to sacrifice for the idea of stability. Their existence becomes less about who they are and more about what they represent. Hallownest clearly shows a hierarchy that mirrors the royalty and class division you see in Pharloom Citadel. The kingdom is divided by status and access to their power. The City of Tears especially reflects this imbalance, with a place designed for those closer to the center of authority and wealth, while still being built on the labor and suffering of those beneath it. Many of the richer citizens are still shown wearing more refined clothing and maintaining a more civilized appearance even as they've been overtaken. Beneath the surface of glory, there's a clear divide where higher status bugs live in relative comfort and stability, while others are left to struggle, work, or survive in harsher regions of the kingdom. Take Godseeker, for example. They aren't interested in protecting a kingdom or helping others. They're obsessed with seeking out and elevating beings of power. To them, strength and divinity are the only things that matter. They worship higher beings not out of compassion or understanding, but out of obsession, constantly searching for something greater to devote themselves to. It turns power into something almost addictive, something to be chased and glorified above everything else. The Weavers play a major role into maintaining the control. They aren't just passive followers, they actively uphold the structure of Pharloom, reinforcing the systems religiously that keep everything bound together. Through song, they represent connection but also restriction, like the entire kingdom is being held in place and maintained so that nothing falls out of line, by even deciding to abandon their own kingdom selfishly as it was falling apart, when they couldn't keep Grandmother Silk at bay. Even leaving it to the conductors show how irresponsible they are. Instead of maintaining order, their absence or abandonment of responsibility leaves Pharloom vulnerable. When those in positions of power fail to guide or stabilize the system, it creates a vacuum where control is no longer structured and everything begins to fall apart. That lack of balance shows others to take advantage, shifting the kingdom further into the instability and decay it already had. Unlike the ruling Mantis Lords who value balance and the preservation of tradition, the fourth Mantis Lord represents ambition and disruption. Their desire for dominance over the tribe breaks the established order, turning what was once a tightly controlled and honorable leadership into internal conflict when wanting to use the power of the infection for her own twisted power. That need for dominance disrupts their original structure and weakens the unity that once defined them, turning discipline into a rivalry. and that connects back to a larger pattern seen throughout the world of Hallownest. Whether it's higher beings, rulers, or even smaller societies, the same idea keeps appearing in different forms. Systems eventually bend toward control, hierarchy, and self-interest. Even groups that initially reject external influence still develop their own internal struggle for dominance, repeating the same cycles on a smaller scale. What I always find interesting is how much the corruption of power is shown more clearly in the vessels themselves. The vessels weren't born as individuals in the normal sense. They were created in the abyss as part of a deliberate attempt to produce something perfect. Perfect enough to serve as a purpose. They were shaped under the idea that only something completely hollow without will or identity could properly contain the burden placed upon them. That means, from the very beginning, their existence wasn't about life or freedom, it was about a function. They are so important thematically that they show how power can be built through suffering. The Pale King's system doesn't just rely on authority at the top, it relies on what is sacrificed underneath it. Countless vessels were discarded because they didn't meet the required standard, meaning their worth was judged entirely on how well they fit into a role they never chose. And in doing so, it creates a form of internal royal pressure to live up to the kingdom's standards. The Hollow Knight itself becomes the clearest example of this, not as a chosen hero, but a constructed solution valued more for its purpose and to make their father proud. Lace is shown as someone who reflects the pressure of being formed within a world that already has authority and expectation built into it. Her identity feels tied to something larger than herself, as if she exists within a role that was defined before she ever had the chance to choose it. That creates a similar kind of tension seen with the vessels, where individuality and purpose are constantly in conflict. Explaining even clearer in her relationship with the grandmother Silk, rather than a warm or personal bond, it feels built around expectation and pressure, where Lace is treated less like an individual and more like someone who meant to become something, a perfect extension of the system grandmother Silk represents. That kind of pressure creates a distance between them, because instead of being accepted for who she is, Lace is constantly being shaped toward what she is expected to be. That's why she feels pity for her discarded sister, Phantom. Not all of them are like this, of course. The White Lady, for example, is one of the pale beings who chose isolation within the Queen's Garden. Unlike more active rulers, she doesn't directly enforce Hallownest's structure in the same way the Pale King does, but she exists within the same framework of order and consequence, acknowledging the cost of what the kingdom became. Similarly, Queen Vespa of the Hive represents a kind of authority that is similar. Hera is one of the dreamers that also fell under this category. She also agrees to become a dreamer, but not just for the kingdom. She also does it in a connection to her role as a mother. She has a child, and part of her choice is tied protecting that child's future, even if it means giving up her own freedom and locking herself away. And that connects to a general pattern in the game, where a lot of mother-like figures of Hornet are shown as complicated but usually protective in some way. Even when things are messy or morally unclear, they often still act out of desire to protect their children or what they see as theirs. Even Grandmother Silk kind of fits into that more in extreme way. Even if her rule or system seems harsh, she still comes off like a figure who instinctively protects Lace near the true ending of Silksong. But still, it all ties back to the main conflict towards the Radiance. She is not just another higher being, she is one of the oldest, after all, before the new era reshaped the world, and in a world where a god's power comes from being remembered, forgetting is death to her. That loss twisted her to becoming angry, desperate, and resentful. And that's where the infection begins, forcing itself back into the minds of the bugs who abandoned her, stripping their individuality away and replacing it with a singular will, turning everything into a hive mind and becoming a parasite. it corrupts even the gods themselves. And that's what connects all of them. These higher beings aren't perfect or all-knowing, and we can probably say part of that comes from the fact that everyone in this world are insects. But I think that's exactly the point. They exist in a world where dominance and power equal their survival, to give need to their own natural instincts. Even mating behaviors from mantises kind of reflect this a little bit more clearly with the fact that they eat their own mates when reproducting. In that sense, these civilizations feel built on that liminal kind of intelligence. And with this, you can kind of understand why both kingdoms fell apart. Because kingdoms like Hallownest or Pharloom don't just end in silence. Even when they fall into ruin, there are still those who continue moving forward through what's left, trying to survive and trying to push forward. Maybe that's the part worth paying attention to, not just on how power falls apart, but how those who live under it still choose to move forward after it does. And even when those systems turn corrupt or begin to collapse under their own weight, that doesn't mean everything within them becomes meaningless. Because in the end of the day, not everything inside a broken kingdom is broken by itself. They exist as proof of humanity in these insects. And in the words of the Pale King himself, there's the idea that no cost is too great. Before I want to end the video, I'd like to give a shout out to Dumb Purple. If any of you guys would want one, please consider joining for channel memberships, which include perks for early access of videos and other future additions I plan to add. And shout out to all the fan art too. Remember to join the Discord. I'm kind of in need for some new moderators soon. And please help consider supporting the channel so I can make more videos like this. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed, and remember to reach for the stars.